Chapter 13 of Phantastes by George MacDonald. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Devora Allen. I saw a ship sailing upon the sea, deeply laden as ship could be, but not so deep as in love I am, for I care not whether I sink or swim. Old Ballad. But love is such a mystery, I cannot find it out, for when I think I'm best resolved, I then am in most doubt. Sir John Suckling. One story I will try to reproduce, but alas, it is like trying to reconstruct a forest out of broken branches and withered leaves. In the fairy book, everything was just as it should be, though whether in words or something else, I cannot tell. It glowed and flashed the thoughts upon the soul, with such a power that the medium disappeared from the consciousness, and it was occupied only with the things themselves. My representation of it must resemble a translation from a rich and powerful language, capable of embodying the thoughts of a splendidly developed people into the meagre and half-articulate speech of a savage tribe. Of course, while I read it, I was Cosmo, and his history was mine. Yet, all the time, I seemed to have a kind of double consciousness, and the story a double meaning. Sometimes it seemed only to represent a simple story of ordinary life, perhaps almost of universal life, wherein two souls, loving each other and longing to come nearer, do, after all, but behold each other as in a glass darkly. As through the hard rock go the branching silver veins, as into the solid land run the creeks and gulfs from the unresting sea, as the lights and influences of the upper world sink silently through the earth's atmosphere, so doth faery invade the world of men, and sometimes startle the common eye with an association as of cause and effect, when between the two no connecting links can be traced. Cosmo von Wehrstahl was a student at the University of Prague. Though of a noble family, he was poor, and prided himself upon the independence that poverty gives, for what will not a man pride himself upon when he cannot get rid of it? A favourite with his fellow students, he yet had no companions, and none of them had ever crossed the threshold of his lodging in the top of one of the highest houses in the old town. Indeed, the secret of much of that complaisance which recommended him to his fellows was the thought of his unknown retreat, whither in the evening he could betake himself, and indulge undisturbed in his own studies and reveries. These studies, besides those subjects necessary to his course at the university, embraced some less commonly known and approved, for in a secret drawer lay the works of Albertus Magnus and Cornelius Agrippa, along with others less read and more abstruse. As yet, however, he had followed these researches only from curiosity, and had turned them to no practical purpose. His lodging consisted of one large, low-ceilinged room, singularly bare of furniture, for besides a couple of wooden chairs, a couch which served for dreaming on both by day and night, and a great press of black oak, there was very little in the room that could be called furniture. But curious instruments were heaped in the corners, and in one stood a skeleton, half leaning against the wall, half supported by a string about its neck. One of its hands, all of fingers, rested on the heavy pommel of a great sword that stood beside it. Various weapons were scattered about over the floor. The walls were utterly bare of adornment, for the few strange things, such as a large dried bat with wings dispread, the skin of a porcupine, and a stuffed sea mouse, could hardly be reckoned as such. But although his fancy delighted in vagaries like these, he indulged his imagination with far different fare. His mind had never yet been filled with an absorbing passion, but it lay like a still twilight open to any wind, whether the low breath that wafts but odours, or the storm that bows the great trees till they strain and creak. He saw everything as through a rose-coloured glass. When he looked from his window on the street below, not a maiden passed but she moved as in a story, and drew his thoughts after her till she disappeared in the vista. When he walked in the streets, he always felt as if reading a tale, into which he sought to weave every face of interest that went by, and every sweet voice swept his soul as with the wing of a passing angel. He was in fact a poet without words. the more absorbed and endangered that the springing waters were dammed back into his soul, where, finding no utterance, they grew and swelled and undermined. He used to lie on his hard couch and read a tale or a poem till the book dropped from his hand, but he dreamed on, he knew not whether awake or asleep, until the opposite roof grew upon his sense and turned golden in the sunrise. Then he arose too, and the impulses of vigorous youth kept him ever active, either in study or in sport, until again the close of the day left him free, and the world of night, which had lain drowned in the cataract of the day, rose up in his soul with all its stars and dim-seen phantom shapes. But this could hardly last long. Some one form must sooner or later step within the charmed circle, enter the house of life, and compel the bewildered magician to kneel and worship. One afternoon, towards dusk, he was wandering dreamily in one of the principal streets, when a fellow student roused him by a slap on the shoulder, and asked him to accompany him into a little back alley to look at some old armour which he had taken a fancy to possess. Cosmo was considered an authority in every matter pertaining to arms, ancient or modern. In the use of weapons none of the students could come near him, and his practical acquaintance with some had principally contributed to establish his authority in reference to all. He accompanied him willingly. They entered a narrow alley, and thence a dirty little court, where a low arched door admitted them into a heterogeneous assemblage of everything musty and dusty and old that could well be imagined. His verdict on the armour was satisfactory, and his companion at once concluded the purchase. As they were leaving the place, Cosmo's eye was attracted by an old mirror of an elliptical shape, which leaned against the wall, covered with dust. Around it was some curious carving, which he could see but very indistinctly by the glimmering light which the owner of the shop carried in his hand. It was this carving that attracted his attention, at least so it appeared to him. He left the place, however, with his friend, taking no further notice of it. They walked together to the main street, where they parted and took opposite directions. No sooner was Cosmo left alone than the thought of the curious old mirror returned to him. A strong desire to see it more plainly arose within him, and he directed his steps once more towards the shop. The owner opened the door when he knocked, as if he had expected him. He was a little, old, withered man, with a hooked nose, and burning eyes constantly in a slow, restless motion, and looking here and there as if after something that eluded them. Pretending to examine several other articles, Cosmo at last approached the mirror, and requested to have it taken down. "Take it down yourself, master. I cannot reach it," said the old man. Cosmo took it down carefully, when he saw that the carving was indeed delicate and costly, being both of admirable design and execution, containing withal many devices which seemed to embody some meaning to which he had no clue. This naturally, in one of his tastes and temperament, increased the interest he felt in the old mirror, so much indeed that he now longed to possess it, in order to study its frame at his leisure. He pretended, however, to want it only for use, and saying he feared the plate could be of little service, as it was rather old, he brushed away a little of the dust from its face, expecting to see a dull reflection within. His surprise was great when he found the reflection brilliant, revealing a glass not only uninjured by age, but wondrously clear and perfect, should the whole correspond to this part, even for one newly from the hands of the maker. He asked carelessly what the owner wanted for the thing. The old man replied by mentioning a sum of money far beyond the reach of poor Cosmo, who proceeded to replace the mirror where it had stood before. "You think the price too high?" said the old man. "I do not know that it is too much for you to ask," replied Cosmo, "but it is far too much for me to give." The old man held up his light towards Cosmo's face. "I like your look," said he. Cosmo could not return the compliment. In fact, now he looked closely at him for the first time, he felt a kind of repugnance to him, mingled with a strange feeling of doubt whether a man or a woman stood before him. "What is your name?" he continued. "Cosmo von Wehrstahl." Ah, I thought as much. I see your father in you. I knew your father very well, young sir. I dare say in some odd corners of my house you might find some old things with his crest and cipher upon them still. Well, I like you. You shall have the mirror at the fourth part of what I asked for it.
but upon one condition."
"What is that?" said Cosmo; for, although the price was still a great deal for him to give, he could just manage it, and the desire to possess the mirror had increased to an altogether unaccountable degree since it had seemed beyond his reach.
"That if you should ever want to get rid of it again, you will let me have the first offer."
"Certainly," replied Cosmo, with a smile, adding, "a moderate condition indeed."
"On your honour?" insisted the seller.
"On my honour," said the buyer, and the bargain was concluded.
"I will carry it home for you," said the old man, as Cosmo took it in his hands.
"No, no, I will carry it myself," said he, for he had a peculiar dislike to revealing his residence to any one, and more especially to this person, to whom he felt every moment a greater antipathy.
"Just as you please,"
said the old creature, and muttered to himself as he held his light at the door to show him out of the court.
"Sold for the 6th time. I wonder what will be the upshot of it this time. I should think my lady had had enough of it by now."
Cosmo carried his prize carefully home, but all the way he had an uncomfortable feeling that he was watched and dogged. Repeatedly he looked about, but saw nothing to justify his suspicions. Indeed, the streets were too crowded and too ill lighted to expose very readily a careful spy, if such there should be at his heels. He reached his lodging in safety, and leaned his purchase against the wall, rather relieved, strong as he was, to be rid of its weight. Then, lighting his pipe, threw himself on the couch, and was soon lapped in the folds of one of his haunting dreams. He returned home earlier than usual the next day, and fixed the mirror to the wall, over the hearth, at one end of his long room. He then carefully wiped away the dust from its face, and, clear as the water of a sunny spring, the mirror shone out from beneath the envious covering. But his interest was chiefly occupied with the curious carving of the frame. This he cleaned as well as he could with a brush, and then he proceeded to a minute examination of its various parts, in the hope of discovering some index to the intention of the carver. In this, however, he was unsuccessful, and at length, pausing with some weariness and disappointment, he gazed vacantly for a few moments into the depths of the reflected room. But ere long he said, half aloud, "What a strange thing a mirror is, and what a wondrous affinity exists between it and a man's imagination! For this room of mine, as I behold it in the glass, is the same, and yet not the same. It is not the mere representation of the room I live in, but it looks just as if I were reading about it in a story I like. All its commonness has disappeared. The mirror has lifted it out of the region of fact into the realm of art, and the very representing of it to me has clothed with interest that which was otherwise hard and bare, just as one sees with delight upon the stage the representation of a character from which one would escape in life as from something unendurably wearisome. But is it not rather that art rescues nature from the weary and sated regards of our senses, and the degrading injustice of our anxious everyday life, and appealing to the imagination, which dwells apart, reveals nature in some degree as she really is, and as she represents herself to the eye of the child, whose everyday life, fearless and unambitious, meets the true import of the wonder-teeming world around him, and rejoices therein without questioning? That skeleton now, I almost fear it, standing there so still, with eyes only for the unseen, like a watch-tower looking across all the waste of this busy world into the quiet regions of rest beyond. And yet I know every bone and every joint in it as well as my own fist, and that old battle-axe looks as if any moment it might be caught up by a mailed hand, and borne forth by the mighty arm, go crashing through casque and skull and brain, invading the unknown with yet another bewildered ghost. I should like to live in that room, if I could only get into it." Scarcely had the half-moulded words floated from him, as he stood gazing into the mirror, when, striking him as with a flash of amazement that fixed him in his posture, noiseless and unannounced, glided suddenly through the door into the reflected room, with stately motion, yet reluctant and faltering step, the graceful form of a woman, clothed all in white. Her back only was visible as she walked slowly up to the couch in the further end of the room, on which she laid herself wearily, turning towards him a face of unutterable loveliness, in which suffering and dislike and a sense of compulsion strangely mingled with the beauty. he stood without the power of motion for some moments, with his eyes irrecoverably fixed upon her, and even after he was conscious of the ability to move, he could not summon up courage to turn and look on her, face to face, in the veritable chamber in which he stood. At length, with a sudden effort, in which the exercise of the will was so pure that it seemed involuntary, he turned his face to the couch. It was vacant. In bewilderment, mingled with terror, he turned again to the mirror. There, on the reflected couch, lay the exquisite lady form. She lay with closed eyes, whence 2 large tears were just welling from beneath the veiling lids, still as death, save for the convulsive motion of her bosom. Cosmo himself could not have described what he felt. His emotions were of a kind that destroyed consciousness, and could never be clearly recalled. He could not help standing yet by the mirror, and keeping his eyes fixed on the lady, though he was painfully aware of his rudeness, and feared every moment that she would open hers, and meet his fixed regard. But he was, ere long, a little relieved, for after a while her eyelids slowly rose, and her eyes remained uncovered, but unemployed for a time, and when at length they began to wander about the room, as if languidly seeking to make some acquaintance with her environment, they were never directed towards him. It seemed nothing but what was in the mirror could affect her vision, and therefore, if she saw him at all, it could only be his back, which of necessity was turned towards her in the glass. The 2 figures in the mirror could not meet face to face, except he turned and looked at her present in his room, and as she was not there, he concluded that if he were to turn towards the part in his room corresponding to that in which she lay, his reflection would either be invisible to her altogether, or at least it must appear to gaze vacantly towards her, and no meeting of the eyes would produce the impression of spiritual proximity. By and by her eyes fell upon the skeleton, and he saw her shudder and close them. She did not open them again, but signs of repugnance continued evident on her countenance. Cosmo would have removed the obnoxious thing at once, but he feared to discompose her yet more by the assertion of his presence which the act would involve. So he stood and watched her. The eyelids yet shrouded the eyes, leaving only a faint sorrow behind. The features settled into an unchanging expression of rest, and by these signs, and the slow regular motion of her breathing, Cosmo knew that she slept. He could now gaze on her without embarrassment. He saw that her figure, dressed in the simplest robe of white, was worthy of her face, and so harmonious that either the delicately moulded foot, or any finger of the equally delicate hand, was an index to the whole. As she lay, her whole form manifested the relaxation of perfect repose. He gazed till he was weary, and at last seated himself near the new-found shrine, and mechanically took up a book, like one who watches by a sick bed. But his eyes gathered no thoughts from the page before him. His intellect had been stunned by the bold contradiction to its face of all its experience, and now lay passive, without assertion, or speculation, or even conscious astonishment, while his imagination sent one wild dream of blessedness after another coursing through his soul. How long he sat he knew not, but at length he roused himself, rose, and trembling in every portion of his frame, looked again into the mirror. She was gone. The mirror reflected faithfully what his room presented, and nothing more. It stood there like a golden setting whence the central jewel has been stolen away, like a night sky without the glory of its stars. She had carried with her all the strangeness of the reflected room. It had sunk to the level of the one without. But when the first pangs of his disappointment had passed, Cosmo began to comfort himself with the hope that she might return, perhaps the next evening at the same hour. Resolving that if she did, she should not at least be scared by the hateful skeleton, he removed that, and several other articles of questionable appearance, into a recess by the side of the hearth, whence they could not possibly cast any reflection into the mirror, and having made his poor room as tidy as he could, sought the solace of the open sky, and of a night wind that had begun to blow, for he could not rest where he was. When he returned, somewhat composed, he could hardly prevail with himself to lie down on his bed, for he could not help feeling as if she had lain upon it, and for him to lie there now would be something like sacrilege. However, Weariness prevailed, and laying himself on the couch, dressed as he was, he slept till day. With a beating heart, beating till he could hardly breathe, he stood in dumb hope before the mirror on the following evening. Again the reflected room shone as through a purple vapour in the gathering twilight. Everything seemed waiting like himself for a coming splendour to glorify its poor earthliness with the presence of a heavenly joy. And just as the room vibrated with the strokes of the neighbouring church bell, announcing the hour of 6, in glided the pale beauty, and again laid herself on the couch. Poor Cosmo nearly lost his senses with delight. She was there once more. Her eyes sought the corner where the skeleton had stood, and a faint gleam of satisfaction crossed her face, apparently at seeing it empty. She looked suffering still, but there was less of discomfort expressed in her countenance than there had been the night before. She took more notice of the things about her, and seemed to gaze with some curiosity on the strange apparatus standing here and there in her room. At length, however, drowsiness seemed to overtake her, and again she fell asleep. Resolved not to lose sight of her this time, Cosmo watched the sleeping form. Her slumber was so deep and absorbing that a fascinating repose seemed to pass contagiously from her to him as he gazed upon her, and he started as if from a dream when the lady moved, and without opening her eyes, rose, and passed from the room with the gait of a somnambulist. Cosmo was now in a state of extravagant delight. Most men have a secret treasure somewhere. The miser has his golden hoard, the virtuoso his pet ring, the student his rare book, the poet his favourite haunt, the lover his secret drawer, but Cosmo had a mirror with a lovely lady in it. And now that he knew by the skeleton that she was affected by the things around her, he had a new object in life. He would turn the bare chamber in the mirror into a room such as no lady need disdain to call her own. This he could effect only by furnishing and adorning his, and Cosmo was poor. Yet he possessed accomplishments that could be turned to account, although hitherto he had preferred living on his slender allowance to increasing his means by what his pride considered unworthy of his rank. He was the best swordsman in the university, and now he offered to give lessons in fencing and similar exercises to such as chose to pay him well for the trouble. His proposal was heard with surprise by the students, but it was eagerly accepted by many, and soon his instructions were not confined to the richer students, but were anxiously sought by many of the young nobility of Prague and its neighbourhood, so that very soon he had a good deal of money at his command. The first thing he did was to remove his apparatus and oddities into a closet in the room. Then he placed his bed and a few other necessaries on each side of the hearth, and parted them from the rest of the room by 2 screens of Indian fabric. Then he put an elegant couch for the lady to lie upon, in the corner where his bed had formerly stood, and by degrees, every day adding some article of luxury, converted it at length into a rich boudoir. Every night, about the same time, the lady entered. The first time she saw the new couch, she started with a half smile. Then her face grew very sad, the tears came to her eyes, and she laid herself upon the couch, and pressed her face into the silken cushions, as if to hide from everything. She took notice of each addition and each change as the work proceeded, and a look of acknowledgment, as if she knew that some one was ministering to her, and was grateful for it, mingled with the constant look of suffering. At length, after she had lain down as usual one evening, her eyes fell upon some paintings with which Cosmo had just finished adorning the walls. She rose, and to his great delight, walked across the room, and proceeded to examine them carefully, testifying much pleasure in her looks as she did so. But again the sorrowful, tearful expression returned, and again she buried her face in the pillows of her couch. Gradually, however, her countenance had grown more composed. Much of the suffering manifest on her first appearance had vanished, and a kind of quiet, hopeful expression had taken its place, which, however, frequently gave way to an anxious, troubled look, mingled with something of sympathetic pity. Meantime, how fared Cosmo? As might be expected in one of his temperament, his interest had blossomed into love, and his love, shall I call it ripened or withered into passion? But alas, he loved a shadow. He could not come near her, could not speak to her, could not hear a sound from those sweet lips, to which his longing eyes would cling like bees to their honey founts. Ever and anon he sang to himself, "I shall die for love of the maiden." And ever he looked again, and died not, though his heart seemed ready to break with intensity of life and longing. And the more he did for her, the more he loved her, and he hoped that, although she never appeared to see him, yet she was pleased to think that one unknown would give his life to her. He tried to comfort himself over his separation from her, by thinking that perhaps some day she would see him, and make signs to him, and that would satisfy him. For, thought he, is not this all that a loving soul can do to enter into communion with another? Nay, how many who love never come nearer than to behold each other as in a mirror, seem to know, and yet never know the inward life, never enter the other soul, and part at last with but the vaguest notion of the universe on the borders of which they have been hovering for years. If I could but speak to her, and knew that she heard me, I should be satisfied. Once he contemplated painting a picture on the wall, which should of necessity convey to the lady a thought of himself. But though he had some skill with the pencil, he found his hand tremble so much when he began the attempt, that he was forced to give it up. Who lives, he dies. Who dies, he is alive. One evening, as he stood gazing on his treasure, he thought he saw a faint expression of self-consciousness on her countenance, as if she surmised that passionate eyes were fixed upon her. This grew, till at last the red blood rose over her neck, and cheek, and brow. Cosmo's longing to approach her became almost delirious. This night she was dressed in an evening costume, resplendent with diamonds. This could add nothing to her beauty, but it presented it in a new aspect, enabled her loveliness to make a new manifestation of itself in a new embodiment. For essential beauty is infinite, and as the soul of nature needs an endless succession of varied forms to embody her loveliness, countless faces of beauty springing forth, not any two the same, at any one of her heart-throbs, so the individual form needs an infinite change of its environments to enable it to uncover all the phases of its loveliness. Diamonds glittered from amidst her hair, half hidden in its luxuriance, like stars through dark rain-clouds, and the bracelets on her white arms flashed all the colours of a rainbow of lightnings, as she lifted her snowy hands to cover her burning face. But her beauty shone down all its adornment. If I might have but one of her feet to kiss, thought Cosmo, I should be content. Alas, he deceived himself, for passion is never content. Nor did he know that there are two ways out of her enchanted house. But suddenly, as if the pang had been driven into his heart from without, revealing itself first in pain, and afterwards in definite form, the thought darted into his mind, she has a lover somewhere. Remembered words of his bring the colour on her face now. I am nowhere to her. She lives in another world all day, and all night after she leaves me. Why does she come and make me love her, till I, a strong man, am too faint to look upon her more? He looked again, and her face was pale as a lily. A sorrowful compassion seemed to rebuke the glitter of the restless jewels, and the slow tears rose in her eyes. She left her room sooner this evening than was her wont. Cosmo remained alone, with a feeling as if his bosom had been suddenly left empty and hollow, and the weight of the whole world was crushing in its walls. The next evening, for the first time since she began to come, she came not. And now Cosmo was in wretched plight. Since the thought of arrival had occurred to him, he could not rest for a moment. More than ever he longed to see the lady face to face. He persuaded himself that if he but knew the worst he would be satisfied, for then he could abandon Prague, and find that relief and constant motion which is the hope of all active minds when invaded by distress. Meantime he waited with unspeakable anxiety for the next night, hoping she would return, but she did not appear. And now he fell really ill. Rallied by his fellow students on his wretched looks, he ceased to attend the lectures. His engagements were neglected. He cared for nothing. The sky, with the great sun in it, was to him a heartless, burning desert. The men and women in the streets were mere puppets, without motives in themselves, or interest to him. He saw them all as on the ever-changing field of a camera obscura. She alone and altogether, was his universe, his well of life, his incarnate good. For 6 evenings she came not. Let his absorbing passion, and the slow fever that was consuming his brain, be his excuse for the resolution which he had taken and begun to execute, before that time had expired. Reasoning with himself that it must be by some enchantment connected with the mirror that the form of the lady was to be seen in it, he determined to attempt to turn to account what he had hitherto studied principally from curiosity. For, he said to himself, if a spell can force her presence in that glass, and she came unwillingly at first, may not a stronger spell, such as I know, especially with the aid of her half-presence in the mirror, if ever she appears again, compel her living form to come to me here? If I do her wrong, let love be my excuse. I want only to know my doom from her own lips. He never doubted, all the time, that she was a real earthly woman, or rather that there was a woman who, somehow or other, threw this reflection of her form into the magic mirror. He opened his secret drawer, took out his books of magic, lighted his lamp, and read and made notes from midnight till 3 in the morning, for 3 successive nights. Then he replaced his books, and the next night went out in quest of the materials necessary for the conjuration. These were not easy to find, for in love charms and all incantations of this nature, ingredients are employed scarcely fit to be mentioned, and for the thought even of which, in connection with her, he could only excuse himself on the score of his bitter need. At length he succeeded in procuring all he required, and on the 7th evening from that on which she had last appeared, he found himself prepared for the exercise of unlawful and tyrannical power. He cleared the centre of the room, stooped and drew a circle of red on the floor around the spot where he stood, wrote in the 4 quarters mystical signs, and numbers which were all powers of 7 or 9, examined the whole ring carefully, to see that no smallest break had occurred in the circumference, and then rose from his bending posture. As he rose, the church clock struck 7, and just as she had appeared the first time, reluctant, slow, and stately, glided in the lady. Cosmo trembled, and when, turning, she revealed a countenance worn and wan, as with sickness or inward trouble, he grew faint, and felt as if he dared not proceed. But as he gazed on the face and form which now possessed his whole soul, to the exclusion of all other joys and griefs, the longing to speak to her, to know that she heard him, to hear from her one word in return, became so unendurable, that he suddenly and hastily resumed his preparations. Stepping carefully from the circle, he put a small brazier into its centre. He then set fire to its contents of charcoal, and while it burned up, opened his window and seated himself, waiting beside it. It was a sultry evening. The air was full of thunder. A sense of luxurious depression filled the brain. The sky seemed to have grown heavy, and to compress the air beneath it. A kind of purplish tinge pervaded the atmosphere, and through the open window came the scents of the distant fields, which all the vapours of the city could not quench. Soon the charcoal glowed. Cosmo sprinkled upon it the incense and other substances which he had compounded, and stepping within the circle, turned his face from the brazier and towards the mirror. Then, fixing his eyes upon the face of the lady, he began with a trembling voice to repeat a powerful incantation. He had not gone far before the lady grew pale, and then, like a returning wave, the blood washed all its banks with its crimson tide, and she hid her face in her hands. Then he passed to a conjuration stronger yet. The lady rose and walked uneasily to and fro in her room. Another spell, and she seemed seeking with her eyes for some object on which they wished to rest. At length it seemed as if she suddenly espied him, for her eyes fixed themselves full and wide upon his, and she drew gradually, and somewhat unwillingly, close to her side of the mirror, just as if his eyes had fascinated her. Cosmo had never seen her so near before. Now at least eyes met eyes, but he could not quite understand the expression of hers. They were full of tender entreaty, but there was something more that he could not interpret. Though his heart seemed to labour in his throat, he would allow no delight or agitation to turn him from his task. Looking still in her face, he passed on to the mightiest charm he knew. Suddenly the lady turned and walked out of the door of her reflected chamber. A moment after, she entered his room with veritable presence, and forgetting all his precautions, he sprang from the charmed circle, and knelt before her. There she stood, the living lady of his passionate visions, alone beside him, in a thundery twilight, and the glow of a magic fire. "Why," said the lady with a trembling voice, "didst thou bring a poor maiden through the rainy streets alone?" "Because I am dying for love of thee. But I only brought thee from the mirror there." "Ah, the mirror!" And she looked up at it, and shuddered. "Alas, I am but a slave while that mirror exists. But do not think it was the power of thy spells that drew me. It was thy longing desire to see me that beat at the door of my heart, till I was forced to yield." "Canst thou love me, then?" said Cosmo, in a voice calm as death, but almost inarticulate with emotion. "I do not know," she replied sadly. "That I cannot tell, so long as I am bewildered with enchantments. It were indeed a joy too great, to lay my head on thy bosom and weep to death, for I think thou lovest me, though I do not know. But—" Cosmo rose from his knees. "I love thee as—nay, I know not what, for since I have loved thee, there is nothing else." He seized her hand. She withdrew it. "No, better not. I am in thy power, and therefore I may not." She burst into tears, and kneeling before him in her turn, said, "Cosmo, if thou lovest me, set me free, even from thyself. Break the mirror." "And shall I see thyself instead?" "That I cannot tell. I will not deceive thee. We may never meet again." A fierce struggle arose in Cosmo's bosom. Now she was in his power. She did not dislike him, at least, and he could see her when he would. To break the mirror would be to destroy his very life, to banish out of his universe the only glory it possessed. The whole world would be but a prison if he annihilated the one window that looked into the paradise of love. Not yet pure in love, he hesitated. With a wail of sorrow the lady rose to her feet. "Ah, he loves me not! He loves me not, even as I love him, and alas, I care more for his love than even for the freedom I ask." "I will not wait to be willing!" cried Cosmo, and sprang to the corner where the great sword stood. Meantime it had grown very dark. Only the embers cast a red glow through the room. He seized the sword by the steel scabbard, and stood before the mirror, but as he heaved a great blow at it with the heavy pommel, the blade slipped halfway out of the scabbard, and the pommel struck the wall above the mirror. At that moment a terrible clap of thunder seemed to burst in the very room beside them, and ere Cosmo could repeat the blow, he fell senseless on the hearth. When he came to himself, he found that the lady and the mirror had both disappeared. He was seized with a brain fever, which kept him to his couch for weeks. When he recovered his reason, he began to think what could have become of the mirror. For the lady, he hoped she had found her way back as she came, but as the mirror involved her fate with its own, he was more immediately anxious about that. He could not think she had carried it away. It was much too heavy, even if it had not been too firmly fixed in the wall, for her to remove it. Then again he remembered the thunder, which made him believe that it was not the lightning, but some other blow that had struck him down. He concluded that, either by supernatural agency, he having exposed himself to the vengeance of the demons in leaving the circle of safety, or in some other mode, the mirror had probably found its way back to its former owner, and, horrible to think of, might have been by this time once more disposed of, delivering up the lady into the power of another man, who, if he used his power no worse than he himself had done, might yet give Cosmo abundant cause to curse the selfish indecision which prevented him from shattering the mirror at once. Indeed, to think that she whom he loved, and who had prayed to him for freedom, should be still at the mercy, in some degree, of the possessor of the mirror, and was at least exposed to his constant observation, was in itself enough to madden a chary lover. Anxiety to be well retarded his recovery, but at length he was able to creep abroad. He first made his way to the old broker's, pretending to be in search of something else. A laughing sneer on the creature's face convinced him that he knew all about it, but he could not see it amongst his furniture, or get any information out of him as to what had become of it. He expressed the utmost surprise at hearing it had been stolen, a surprise which Cosmo saw at once to be counterfeited, while at the same time he fancied that the old wretch was not at all anxious to have it mistaken for genuine. Full of distress, which he concealed as well as he could, he made many searches, but with no avail. Of course he could ask no questions, but he kept his ears awake for any remotest hint that might set him in a direction of search. He never went out without a short heavy hammer of steel about him, that he might shatter the mirror the moment he was made happy by the sight of his lost treasure, if ever that blessed moment should arrive. Whether he should see the lady again was now a thought altogether secondary, and postponed to the achievement of her freedom. He wandered here and there like an anxious ghost, pale and haggard, gnawed ever at the heart by the thought of what she might be suffering, all from his fault. One night he mingled with a crowd that filled the rooms of one of the most distinguished mansions in the city, for he accepted every invitation, that he might lose no chance, however poor, of obtaining some information that might expedite his discovery. Here he wandered about, listening to every stray word that he could catch, in the hope of a revelation. As he approached some ladies who were talking quietly in a corner, one said to another, "Have you heard of the strange illness of the Princess von Hohenweiss?" "Yes, she has been ill for more than a year now. It is very sad for so fine a creature to have such a terrible malady. She was better for some weeks lately, but within the last few days the same attacks have returned, apparently accompanied with more suffering than ever. It is altogether an inexplicable story." "Is there a story connected with her illness?" "I have only heard imperfect reports of it, but it is said that she gave offence some 18 months ago to an old woman who had held an office of trust in the family, and who, after some incoherent threats, disappeared. This peculiar affection followed soon after. But the strangest part of the story is its association with the loss of an antique mirror, which stood in her dressing-room, and of which she constantly made use." Here the speaker's voice sank to a whisper, and Cosmo, although his very soul sat listening in his ears, could hear no more. He trembled too much to dare address the ladies, even if it had been advisable to expose himself to their curiosity. The name of the princess was well known to him, but he had never seen her, except indeed it was she, which now he hardly doubted, who had knelt before him on that dreadful night. Fearful of attracting attention, for, from the weak state of his health, he could not recover an appearance of calmness, he made his way to the open air, and reached his lodgings, glad in this, that he at least knew where she lived, although he never dreamed of approaching her openly, even if he should be happy enough to free her from her hateful bondage. He hoped, too, that as he had unexpectedly learned so much, the other and far more important part might be revealed to him ere long. "Have you seen Steinwald lately?" "No, I have not seen him for some time. He is almost a match for me at the rapier, and I suppose he thinks he needs no more lessons." "I wonder what has become of him. I want to see him very much. Let me see. The last time I saw him he was coming out of that old broker's den, to which, if you remember, you accompanied me once to look at some armour. That is fully 3 weeks ago." This hint was enough for Cosmo. Von Steinwald was a man of influence in the court, well known for his reckless habits and fierce passions. The very possibility that the mirror should be in his possession was hell itself to Cosmo. But violent or hasty measures of any sort were most unlikely to succeed. All that he wanted was an opportunity of breaking the fatal glass, and to obtain this he must bide his time. He revolved many plans in his mind, but without being able to fix upon any. At length one evening, as he was passing the house of von Steinwald, he saw the windows more than usually brilliant. He watched for a while, and seeing that company began to arrive, hastened home, and dressed as richly as he could, in the hope of mingling with the guests unquestioned, in effecting which there could be no difficulty for a man of his carriage. In a lofty, silent chamber, in another part of the city, lay a form more like marble than a living woman. The loveliness of death seemed frozen upon her face, for her lips were rigid, and her eyelids closed. Her long white hands were crossed over her breast, and no breathing disturbed their repose. Beside the dead, men speak in whispers, as if the deepest rest of all could be broken by the sound of a living voice. Just so, though the soul was evidently beyond the reach of all intimations from the senses, the two ladies who sat by her spoke in the gentlest tones of subdued sorrow. She has lain so for an hour. This cannot last long, I fear. How much thinner she has grown within the last few weeks! If she would only speak and explain what she suffers, it would be better for her. I think she has visions in her trances, but nothing can induce her to refer to them when she is awake. Does she ever speak in these trances? I have never heard her, but they say she walks sometimes, and once put the whole household in a terrible fright by disappearing for a whole hour, and returning drenched with rain, and almost dead with exhaustion and fright. But even then she would give no account of what had happened. A scarce audible murmur from the yet motionless lips of the lady here startled her attendants. After several ineffectual attempts at articulation, the word "Cosmo!" burst from her. Then she lay still as before, but only for a moment. With a wild cry she sprang from the couch erect on the floor, flung her arms above her head with clasped and straining hands, and her wide eyes flashing with light, called aloud, with a voice exultant as that of a spirit bursting from a sepulchre, "I am free! I am free! I thank thee!" Then she flung herself on the couch and sobbed, then rose and paced wildly up and down the room, with gestures of mingled delight and anxiety. Then turning to her motionless attendants, "Quick, Lisa, my cloak and hood!" Then lower, "I must go to him. Make haste, Lisa! You may come with me if you will." In another moment they were in the street, hurrying along towards one of the bridges over the Moldau. The moon was near the zenith, and the streets were almost empty. The princess soon outstripped her attendant, and was halfway over the bridge before the other reached it. "Are you free, lady? The mirror is broken. Are you free?" The words were spoken close beside her as she hurried on. She turned, and there, leaning on the parapet in a recess of the bridge, stood Cosmo, in a splendid dress, but with a white and quivering face. "Cosmo! I am free, and thy servant forever. I was coming to you now." "And I to you, for death made me bold, but I could get no further. Have I atoned at all? Do I love you a little, truly?" "Ah, I know now that you love me, my Cosmo. But what do you say about death?" He did not reply. His hand was pressed against his side. She looked more closely. The blood was welling from between the fingers. She flung her arms around him with a faint, bitter wail. When Lisa came up, she found her mistress kneeling above a wan, dead face, which smiled on in the spectral moonbeams. And now I will say no more about these wondrous volumes, though I could tell many a tale out of them, and could perhaps vaguely represent some entrancing thoughts of a deeper kind which I found within them. From many a sultry noon till twilight did I sit in that grand hall, buried and risen again in these old books, and I trust I have carried away in my soul some of the exhalations of their undying leaves. In after hours of deserved or needful sorrow, portions of what I read there have often come to me again, with an unexpected comforting, which was not fruitless, even though the comfort might seem in itself groundless and vain. End of Chapter 13 of Phantastes, by George MacDonald.
The Taoist Priests of Lao Shan, from Strange Stories from a Chinese Studio, translated and annotated by Herbert A. Giles. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. The Taoist Priests of Lao Shan, translated and annotated by Herbert A. Giles. There lived in our village a Mr. Wang, the seventh son of an old family. This gentleman had a penchant for the Taoist religion, and hearing that at Lao Shan there were plenty of immortals, shouldered his knapsack and went off for a tour thither. Ascending the peak of the mountain, he reached a secluded monastery, where he found a priest sitting on a rush mat, with long hair flowing over his neck, and a pleasant expression on his face. Making a low bow, Wang addressed him thus: "Mysterious indeed is the doctrine. I pray you, sir, instruct me therein." Delicately nurtured and wanting in energy as you are, replied the priest, I fear you would not support the fatigue. Try me, said Wang. So when the disciples, who were very many in number, collected together at dusk, Wang joined them in making obeisance to the priest, and remained with them in the monastery. Very early next morning the priest summoned Wang, and giving him a hatchet sent him out with the others to cut firewood. Wang respectfully obeyed, continuing to work for over a month until his hands and feet were so swollen and blistered that he secretly meditated returning home. One evening when he came back, he found two strangers sitting drinking with his master. It being already dark, and no lamp or candles having been brought in, the old priest took some scissors and cut out a circular piece of paper like a mirror. Then he proceeded to stick it up against the wall. Immediately it became a dazzling moon, by the light of which you could see the hair or beard of corn. The disciples all came crowding around to wait upon them, but one of the strangers said, On a festive occasion like this, we ought all to enjoy ourselves together. Accordingly, he took the kettle of wine from the table and presented it to the disciples, bidding them drink each his fill, whereupon our friend Wang began to wonder how 7 or 8 of them could all be served out of a single kettle. The disciples, too, rushed about in search of cups, each struggling to get the first drink, for fear the wine would soon be exhausted. Nevertheless, all the candidates failed to empty the kettle, at which they were very much astonished. Then suddenly one of the strangers said, You have given us a fine bright moon, but it's dull work drinking by ourselves. Why not call Chiang Nyo to join us? He then seized a chopstick and threw it at the moon, whereupon a lovely girl stepped forth from its beams. At first she was only a foot high, but on reaching the ground lengthened to the ordinary size of woman. She had a slender waist and a beautiful neck, and went most gracefully through the red garment figure. When this was finished, she sang the following words: Ye fairies, I'm coming back soon. Too lonely and cold is my home in the moon. Her voice was clear and well sustained, ringing like the notes of a flageolet, and when she had concluded her song, she pirouetted round and jumped up on the table, where, with every eye fixed in astonishment upon her, she once more became a chopstick. The 3 friends laughed out loud, and one of them said, We are very jolly tonight, but I have hardly room for any more wine. Will you drink a parting glass with me in the palace of the moon? They then took up the table and walked into the moon, where they could be seen drinking so plainly that their eyebrows and beards appeared like reflections in a looking-glass. By and by the moon became obscured, and when the disciples brought the lighted candle, they found the priest sitting in the dark alone. The viands, however, were still upon the table, and the mirror-like piece of paper on the wall. Have you all had enough to drink? Asked the priest, to which they answered that they had. In that case, he said, you had better get to bed, so as not to be behindhand with your wood-cutting in the morning. So they all went off, and among them Wang, who was delighted at what he had seen, and thought no more of returning home. But after a time he could not stand it any longer, and as the priest taught him no magical arts, he determined not to wait, but went to him and said, Sir, I traveled many long miles for the benefit of your instruction. If you will not teach me the secret of immortality, let me at any rate learn some trifling trick, and thus soothe my cravings for a knowledge of your art. I have now been here 2 or 3 months, doing nothing but chopping firewood, out in the morning, back at night, work to which I was never accustomed in my own home. Did I not tell you, replied the priest, that you would never support the fatigue? Tomorrow I will start you on your way home. "Sir," said Wang, "I have worked for you a long time. Teach me some small art, that my coming here may not have been wholly in vain." "What art?" asked the priest. "Well," answered Wang, "I have noticed that whenever you walk anywhere, walls and so on are no obstacle to you. Teach me this, and I'll be satisfied." The priest laughingly assented and taught Wang a formula, which he bade him recite. When he had done so, he told him to walk through the wall. But Wang, seeing the wall in front of him, didn't like to walk at it. As, however, the priest bade him try, he walked quietly up to it, and was there stopped. The priest here cried out, "Don't go slowly. Put your head down and rush at it." So Wang stepped back a few paces and went at it full speed, and the wall yielded to him as he passed. In a moment he found himself outside. Delighted at this, he went to thank the priest, who told him to be careful in the using of his power, or otherwise there would be no response, handing him at the same time some money for his expenses on the way. When Wang got home, he went about bragging of his Taoist friends, and his contempt for walls in general. But as his wife disbelieved his story, he set about going through the performance as before. Stepping back from the wall, he rushed at it full speed with his head down, but coming in contact with the hard bricks, finished up in a heap on the floor. His wife picked him up and found he had a bump on his forehead as big as a large egg, at which she roared with laughter. But Wang was overwhelmed with rage and shame, and cursed the old priest for his base ingratitude. The end of The Taoist Priest of Lao Shan, translated and annotated by Herbert A. Giles.
The Thing on the Hearth by Melville Davisson Post. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Thing on the Hearth. The first confirmatory evidence of the thing, Excellency, was the print of a woman's bare foot. He was an immense creature. He sat in an upright chair that seemed to have been provided especially for him. The great bulk of him flowed out and filled the chair. It did not seem to be fat that enveloped him. It seemed rather to be some soft, tough fibre, like the pudgy mass making up the body of a deep-sea thing. One got an impression of strength. The country was before the open window. The clusters of cultivated shrub on the sweep of velvet lawn extending to the great wall that enclosed the place, then the bend of the river, and beyond, the distant mountains, blue and mysterious, blending indiscernibly into the sky. A soft sun, clouded with the haze of autumn, shone over it. You know how the faint moisture of the bare foot will make an impression. He paused, as though there was some compelling force in the reflection. It was impossible to say, with accuracy, to what race the man belonged. He came from some queer blend of Eastern peoples. His body and the cast of his features were Mongolian, but one got always before him a feeling of the hot East lying low down against the stagnant Suez. One felt that he had risen slowly into our world of hard air and sun out of the vast sweltering ooze of it. He spoke English with a certain care in the selection of the words, but with ease and an absence of effort, as though languages were instinctive to him, as though he could speak any language. And he impressed one with this same effortless facility in all things he did. It is necessary to try to understand this, because it explains the conception everybody got of the creature when they saw him in charge of Rodman. I am using precisely the descriptive words. He was exclusively in charge of Rodman, as a djinn in an Arabian tale might be in charge of a king's son. The creature was servile, with almost a grovelling servility, but one felt that this servility resulted from something potent and secret. One looked to see Rodman take Solomon's ring out of his waistcoat pocket. I suppose there is no longer any doubt about the fact that Rodman was one of those gigantic human intelligences who sometimes appear in the world, and by their immense conceptions dwarf all human knowledge, a sort of mental monster that we feel nature has no right to produce. Lord Baylis Truxley said that Rodman was some generations in advance of the time, and Lord Baylis Truxley was, beyond question, the greatest authority on synthetic chemistry in the world. Rodman was rich and, everybody supposed, indolent. No one ever thought very much about him until he published his brochure on the scientific manufacture of precious stones. Then, instantly, everybody with any pretension to a knowledge of synthetic chemistry turned toward him. The brochure startled the world. It proposed to adapt the lustre and beauty of jewels to commercial uses. We were being content with crude imitation colours in our commercial glass, when we could quite as easily have the actual structure and the actual lustre of the jewel in it. We were painfully hunting over the earth and in its bowels for a few crystals and prettily coloured stones, which we hoarded and treasured, when in a manufacturing laboratory we could easily produce them, more perfect than nature, and in unlimited quantity. Now, if you want to understand what I am printing here about Rodman, you must think about this thing as a scientific possibility, and not as a fantastic notion. Take, for example, Rodman's address before the Sorbonne, or his report to the International Congress of Science in Edinburgh, and you will begin to see what I mean. The Marchese Giovanni, who was a delegate to that Congress, and Pastreau, said that the something in the way of the actual practical realization of what Rodman outlined was the formulae. If Rodman could work out the formulae, jewel stuff could be produced as cheaply as glass, and in any quantity, by the carload. Imagine it, sheet ruby, sheet emerald, all the beauty and lustre of jewels in the windows of the corner drugstore. And there is another thing that I want you to think about. Think about the immense destruction of value. Not to us so greatly, for our stocks of precious stones are not large, but the thing meant, practically, wiping out all the assembled wealth of Asia, except the actual earth and its structures. The destruction of value was incredible. Put the thing some other way and consider it. Suppose we should suddenly discover that pure gold could be produced by treating common yellow clay with sulphuric acid, or that some genius should set up a machine on the border of the Sahara that received sand at one end and turned out sacked wheat at the other. What, then, would our hoarded gold be worth, or the wheatlands of Australia, Canada, or our Northwest? The illustrations are fantastic, but the thing Rodman was after was a practical fact. He had it on the way. Giovanni and Lord Baylis Truxley were convinced that the man would work out the formulae. They tried, over their signatures, to prepare the world for it. The whole of Asia was appalled. The Rajas of the native states in India prepared a memorial and sent it to the British government. The thing came out after the mysterious, incredible tragedy. I should not have written that final sentence. I want you to think just now about the great hulk of a man that sat in his big chair beyond me at the window. It was like Rodman to turn up with an outlandish human creature attending him hand and foot. How the thing came about reads like a lie. It reads like a lie. Wildest lie that anybody ever put forward to explain a big yellow Oriental following one about. But it was no lie. You could not think up a lie to equal the actual things that happened to Rodman. Take the way he died. The thing began in India. Rodman had gone there to consult with the Marchese Giovanni concerning some molecular theory that was involved in his formulas. Giovanni was digging up a buried temple in the northern border of the Punjab. One night, in the explorer's tent near the excavations, this inscrutable creature walked in on Rodman. No one knew how he got into the tent, or where he came from. Giovanni told him about it. The tent flap simply opened and the big Oriental appeared. He had something under his arm rolled up in a prayer carpet. He gave no attention to Giovanni, but he salaamed like a coolie to the little American. "Master," he said, "you were hard to find. I have looked over the world for you." And he squatted down on the dirty floor by Rodman's camp stool. Now, that's precisely the truth. I suppose any ordinary person would have started no end of fuss, but not Rodman, and not, I think, Giovanni. There's the attitude that we can't understand in a genius. Did you ever know a man with an inventive mind who doubted a miracle? A thing like that did not seem unreasonable to Rodman. The two men spent the remainder of the night looking at the present that the creature brought Rodman in his prayer carpet. They wanted to know where the Oriental got it, and that's how his story came out. He was something, searcher seems our nearest English word for it, in the great Shan monastery on the southeastern plateau of the Gobi. He was looking for Rodman because he had the light. Here was another word that the two men could find no term in any modern language to translate. A little flame was the literal meaning. The present was from the treasure room of the monastery. The very carpet around it, Giovanni said, was worth 20,000 lire. There was another thing that came out in the talk that Giovanni afterward recalled. Rodman was to accept the present and the man who brought it to him. The Oriental would protect him in every way, in every direction, from things visible and invisible. He made quite a speech about it. But there was one thing from which he could not protect him. The Oriental used a lot of his ancient words to explain, and he did not get it very clear. He seemed to mean that the creative forces of the spirit would not tolerate a division of worship with the creative forces of the body, the celibate notion in the monastic idea. Giovanni thought Rodman did not understand it. He thought he himself understood it better. The monk was pledging Rodman to a high virtue, in the lapse of which something awful was sure to happen. Giovanni wrote a letter to the State Department when he learned what had happened to Rodman. The State Department turned it over to the court at the trial. I think it was one of the things that influenced the judge in his decision. Still, at the time, there seemed no other reasonable decision to make. The testimony must have appeared incredible. It must have appeared fantastic. No man reading the record could have come to any other conclusion about it. Yet it seemed impossible, at least it seemed impossible for me, to consider this great vital bulk of a man as a monk of one of the oldest religious orders in the world. Every common academic conception of such a monk he distinctly negatived. He impressed me instead as possessing the ultimate qualities of clever diplomacy, the subtle ambassador of some new Oriental power, shrewd, suave, accomplished. When one read the yellow-backed court record, the sense of old, obscure, mysterious agencies moving in sinister menace, invisibly, around Rodman could not be escaped from. You believed it. Against your reason, against all modern experience of life, you believed it. And yet it could not be true. One had to find that verdict or topple over all human knowledge. That is, all human knowledge as we understand it. The judge, cutting short the criminal trial, took the only way out of the thing. There was one man in the world that everybody wished could have been present at the time. That was Sir Henry Marquis. Marquis was chief of the Criminal Investigation Department of Scotland Yard. He had been in charge of the English Secret Service on the frontier of the Shan States, and at the time he was in Asia. As soon as Scotland Yard could release Sir Henry, it sent him. Rodman's genius was the common property of the world. The American government could not, even with the verdict of a trial court, let Rodman's death go by under the smoke-screen of such a weird, inscrutable mystery. I was to meet Sir Henry and come here with him, but my train into New England was delayed, and when I arrived at the station I found that Marquis had gone down to have a look at Rodman's country house, where the thing had happened. It was on an isolated forest ridge of the Berkshires, no human soul within a dozen miles of it. A comfortable stone house in the English fashion. There was a big drawing-room across one end of it, with an immense fireplace framed in black marble under a great white panel to the ceiling. It had a wide black marble hearth. There is an excellent photograph of it in the record, showing the single andiron, that mysterious andiron upon which the whole tragedy seemed to turn as on a hinge. Rodman used this drawing-room for a workshop. He kept it close-shuttered and locked. Not even his big, yellow, servile creature who took exclusive care of him in the house was allowed to enter, except under Rodman's eye. What he saw in the final scenes of the tragedy, he saw looking in through a crack under the door. The earlier things he noticed when he put logs on the fire at dark. Time is hardly a measure for the activities of the mind. These reflections winged by in a scarcely perceptible interval of it. They have taken me some time to write out here, but they crowded past while the big Oriental was speaking, in the pause between his words. The print, he continued, was the first confirmation of evidence, but it was not the first indicatory sign. I doubt if the master himself noticed the thing at the beginning. The seductions of this disaster could not have come quickly, and besides that, Excellency, the agencies behind the material world get a footing in it only with continuous pressure. Do not receive a wrong impression, Excellency. To the eye a thing will suddenly appear, but the invisible pressure will have been for some time behind that materialization. He paused. The master was sunk in his labour, and while that enveloped him, the first advances of the lure would have gone by unnoticed, and the tension of the pressure. But the day was at hand when the master was receptive. He had got his work completed, the formula pencilled out, were on his table. I knew by the relaxation. Of all periods, this is the one most dangerous to the human spirit. He sat silent for a moment, his big fingers moving on the arms of the chair. I knew, he added. Then he went on. But it was the one thing against which I could not protect him. The test was to be permitted. He made a vague gesture. The master was indicated, but the peril antecedent to his elevation remained. It was to be permitted, and at its leisure, and in its choice of time. He turned sharply towards me, the folds of his face unsteady. "Excellency," he cried, "I would have saved the master. I would have saved him with my soul's damnation. But it was not permitted. On that first night in the Italian's tent I said all I could." His voice went into a higher note. "Twice, for the master, I have been checked and reduced in merit. For that bias I was myself encircled. I was in an agony of spirit when I knew that the thing was beginning to advance, but my very will to aid was at the time environed." His voice descended. He sat motionless, as though the whole bulk of him were devitalized and maintained its outline only by the enclosing frame of the chair. "It began, Excellency, on the August night. There is a chill in these mountains at sunset. I had put wood into the fireplace and lighted it, and was about the house. The master, as I have said, had worked out his formulae. He was at leisure. I could not see him, for the door was closed, but the odour of his cigar escaped from the room. It was very silent. I was placing the master's bed candle on the table in the hall, when I heard his voice. You have read it, Excellency, as the scriveners wrote it down before the judge." He paused. It was an exclamation of surprise, of astonishment. Then I heard the master get up softly and go over to the fireplace. Presently he returned. He got a new cigar, Excellency, clipped it and lighted it. I could hear the blade of the knife on the fibre of the tobacco, and, of course, clearly the rasp of the match. A moment later I knew that he was in the chair again. The odour of ignited tobacco returned. It was some time before there was another sound in the room. Then suddenly I heard the master swear. His voice was sharp and astonished. This time, Excellency, he got up swiftly and crossed the room to the fireplace. I could hear him distinctly. There was the sound of one tapping on metal, thumping it as with the fingers. He stopped again, for a brief moment, as in reflection. It was then that the master unlocked the door and asked for the liquor. He indicated the court record in my pocket. I brought it, a goblet of brandy, with some carbonated water. He drank it all without putting down the glass. His face was strange, Excellency. Then he looked at me. "Put a log on the fire," he said. I went in and added wood to the fire and came out. The master remained in the doorway. He re-entered when I came out, and closed the door behind him. There was a long silence after that. Then I heard the voice, permitted to the devocation, thin, metallic, offering the barter to the master. It began and ceased because the master was on his feet and before the fireplace. I heard him swear again, and presently return to his place by the table. The big Oriental lifted his face and looked out at the sweep of country before the window. The thing went on, Excellency, the voice offering its lure and presenting it in brief flashes of materialization, and the master endeavouring to seize and detain the visitations, which ceased instantly at his approach to the hearth. The man paused. I knew the master contended in vain against the thing. If he would acquire possession of what it offered, he must destroy what the creative forces of the spirit had released to him. Again he paused. Toward morning he went out of the house. I could hear him walking on the gravel before the door. He would walk the full length of the house and return. The night was clear. There was a chill in it, and every sound was audible. That was all, Excellency. The master returned a little later and ascended to his bedroom as usual. Then he added, "It was when I went in to put wood on the fire that I saw the footprint on the hearth." There was a force, compelling and vivid, in these meagre details, the severe suppression of things, big and tragic. No elaboration could have equalled in effect the virtue of this restraint. The man was going on, directly, with the story. The following night, Excellency, the thing happened. The master had passed the day in the open. He dined with a good appetite, like a man in health. And there was a change in his demeanour. He had the aspect of men who are determined to have a thing out at any hazard. After his dinner the master went into the drawing-room and closed the door behind him. He had not entered the room on this day. It had stood locked and close-shuttered. The big Oriental paused and made a gesture outward with his fingers, as if one dismissing an absurdity. No living human being could have been concealed in that room. There is only the bare floor, the master's table, and the fireplace. The great wood shutters were bolted in, as they had stood since the master took the room from a workshop and removed the furniture. The door was always locked with that special thief-proof lock that the American smiths had made for it. No one could have entered. It was the report of the experts at the trial. They showed by the casing of rust on the bolts that the shutters had not been moved. The walls, ceiling, and floor were undisturbed. The throat of the chimney was coated evenly with old soot. Only the door was possible as an entry, and this was always locked except when Rodman was himself in the room, and at such times the big Oriental never left his post in the hall before it. That seemed a condition of his mysterious overcare of Rodman. Everybody thought the trial court went to an excessive care. It scrutinized in minute detail every avenue that could possibly lead to a solution of the mystery. The whole country and every resident was inquisitioned. The conclusion was inevitable. There was no human creature on that forest crest of the Berkshires but Rodman and his servant. But one can see why the trial judge kept at the thing. He was seeking an explanation consistent with the common experience of mankind. And when he could not find it, he did the only thing he could do. He was wrong, as we now know, but he had a hold in the dark on the truth. Not the whole truth by any means. He never had a glimmer of that. He never had the faintest conception of the big, amazing truth. But as I have said, he had his fingers on one essential fact. The man was going on with a slow, precise articulation, as though he would thereby make a difficult matter clear. The night had fallen swiftly. It was incredibly silent. There was no sound in the master's room, and no light except the flicker of the logs smouldering in the fireplace. The thin line of it appeared faintly along the sill of the door. He paused. The fireplace, Excellency, is at the end of the great room, directly opposite this door into the hall, before which I always sat when the master was within. The fireplace is of black marble, with an immense black marble hearth, and the gift which I had brought the master stands on the side of the fire, on this marble hearth, as though it were a single andiron. The man turned back into the heart of his story. I knew by the vague sense of pressure that the devocations of the thing were again on the way, and I began to suffer in the spirit for the master's safety. Interference, both by act and by the will, were denied me, but there is an anxiety of spirit, Excellency, that the uncertainty of an issue makes intolerable. The man paused. The pressure continued, and in silence. It was nearly midnight. I could not distinguish any act or motion of the master, and in fear I crept over to the door and looked in through the crevice along the threshold. The master sat by his table. He was straining forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. His eyes and every tense instinct of the man were concentrated on the fireplace. The red light of the embers was in the room. I could see him clearly, and the table beyond him with the calculations. But the fireplace seemed strangely out of perspective. It extended above me. My gift to the master, not more than 4 handbreadths in length, including the base, stood now like an immense bronze on an extended marble slab beside a gigantic fireplace. This effect of extension put the top of the fireplace and the enlarged andiron above its pedestal out of my line of vision. Everything else in the chamber, holding its normal dimensions, was visible to me. The master's face was a little lifted. He was looking at the elevated portions of the andiron which were invisible to me. He did not move. The steady light threw half of his face into shadow, but in the other half every feature stood out sharply as in a delicate etching. It had that refined sharpness and distinction which intense moments of stress stamp on the human face. He did not move, and there was no sound. I have said, Excellency, that my angle of vision along the crevice of the door sill was sharply cut midway of this now enlarged fireplace. From the direction and lift of the master's face, he was watching something above this line and directly over the pedestal of the andiron. I watched also, flattening my face against the sill, for the thing to appear. And it did appear. A naked foot became slowly visible, as though some one were descending with extreme care from the elevation of the andiron to the great marble hearth, under this strange enlargement, now some distance below. The big Oriental paused and looked down at me. I knew then, Excellency, that the master was lost. The creative energies of the spirit suffer no division of worship. Those of the body must be wholly denied. I had warned the master, and in travail, Excellency, I turned over with my face to the floor. But there is always hope, hope over the certainties of experience, over the certainties of knowledge. Perhaps the master even now, sustained in the spirit, would put away the devocation. No, Excellency, I was not misled. I knew the master was beyond hope. But the will to hope moved me, and I turned back to the crevice at the door-sill. He paused. There was now a delicate odour everywhere, faintly, like the blossom of the little bitter apple here in your country. The red embers in the fireplace gave out a steady light, and in the glow of it, on the marble hearth, stood the one who had descended from the elevation of the andiron. Again the man hesitated, as for an accurate method of expression. In the flesh, Excellency, there was colour that would not appear in the image. The hair was yellow, and the eyes were blue, and against the black marble of the fireplace the body was conspicuously white, but in every other aspect of her, Excellency, the woman was on the hearth in the flesh as she was in the clutch of the savage male figure in the image. There is no dress or ornament, as you will recall, Excellency, not even an ear jewel or an anklet, as though the graver of the image felt that the inherent beauty of this figure could take nothing from these ostentations. The woman's heavy yellow hair was wound around her head, as in the image. She shivered a little, faintly, like a naked child in an unaccustomed draught of air, although she stood on the warm marble hearth and within the red glow of the fire. The voice from the male figure of the image, which I had brought to the master, and which stood as the andiron, now so immensely enlarged, was beginning again to speak. The thin metallic sounds seemed to splinter against the dense silence as it went forward in the ritual prescribed. But the master had already decided. He stood now on the great marble hearth, with his papers crushed together, and as I looked on, through the crevice under the door-sill, he put out his free hand and with his finger touched the woman gently. The flesh under his finger yielded, and stooping over, he put the formulas into the fire. Like one who has come to the end of his story, the huge Oriental stopped. He remained for some moments silent. Then he continued in an even, monotonous tone. I got up from the floor then and purified myself with water, and after that I went into an upper chamber, opened the window to the east, and sat down to write my report to the Brotherhood. For the thing which I had been sent to do was finished. He put his hand somewhere into the loose folds of his Oriental garment and brought out a roll of thin vellum-like onion skin, painted in Chinese characters. It was of immense length, but on account of the thinness of the vellum, the roll wound on a tiny cylinder of wood was not above 2 inches in thickness. "Excellency," he said, "I have carefully concealed this report through the misfortunes that have attended me. It is not certain that I shall be able to deliver it. Will you give it for me to the jewel merchant Vanderdick in Amsterdam? He will send it to Mahadal in Bombay, and it will go north with the caravans." His voice changed into a note of solicitation. "You will not fail me, Excellency. Already for my bias to the master I am reduced in merit." I put the scroll into my pocket and went out, for the motor car had come into the park, and I knew that Marquis had arrived. I met Sir Henry and the superintendent in the long corridor. They had been looking in at my interview through the elevated grating. "Marquis," I cried, "the judge was right to cut short the criminal trial and issue a lunacy warrant. This creature is the maddest lunatic in this whole asylum. The human mind is capable of any absurdity." Sir Henry looked at me with a queer ironical smile. "The judge was wrong," he said. "The creature, as you call him, is as sane as any of us." "Then you believe this amazing story?" I said. "I believe Rodman was found at daylight, dead on the hearth, with practically every bone in his body crushed," he replied. "Certainly," I said. "We all know that is true. But why was he killed?" Again Sir Henry regarded me with his ironical smile. "Perhaps," he drawled, "there is some explanation in the report in your pocket to the monastic head. It's only a theory, you know." He smiled, showing his white, even teeth. We went into the superintendent's room, and sat down by a smouldering fire of coals in the grate. I handed Marquis the roll of vellum. It was in one of the Shan dialects. He read it aloud, with the addition of certain formal expressions. It contained precisely the Oriental's testimony before the court, and no more. "Ah!" he said, in his curiously inflected Oxford voice, and he held the scroll out to the heat of the fire. The vellum baked slowly, and as it baked, the black Chinese characters faded out, and faint blue ones began to appear. Marquis read the secret message in his emotionless drawl. "The American is destroyed, and his accursed work is destroyed with him. Send the news to Bangkok and west to Burma. The treasures of India are saved." I cried out in astonishment. "An assassin! The creature was an assassin! He killed Rodman simply by crushing him in his arms?" Sir Henry's drawl lengthened. "It's Lal Gupta," he said, "the cleverest Oriental in the whole of Asia. The jewel traders sent him to watch Rodman, and to kill him if he was ever able to get his formulae worked out. They must have paid him an incredible sum." "And that is why the creature attached himself to Rodman?" I said. "Surely," replied Sir Henry. "He brought that bronze Romulus carrying off the Sabine woman and staged the supernatural to work out his plan and to save his life. I knew the bronze as soon as I got my eye on it. Old Franz Joseph gave it as a present to Mahadal in Bombay for matching up some rubies." I swore bitterly. "And we took him for a lunatic?" "Ah, yes," replied Sir Henry. "What was it you said as I came in? The human mind is capable of any absurdity." End of The Thing on the Hearth, by Melville Davisson Post.
Story of Toki and the Apple, by Saxo Grammaticus, circa 1204. From the first 9 books of the Danish history. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. One Toki, who had served some while with the king, Harold Blutroth, had made many men foes to his virtues by the services wherein he overpassed the zeal of his comrades. Taking in his cups among the feasters, he chanced to boast that if an apple, however small, were set at a distance upon a stick, he would hit it with the first shaft he aimed. This speech, catching the ears of his detractors, reached the hearing of the king. But the unscrupulous monarch presently turned the father's confidence to the peril of the son, and commanded that this most sweet pledge of Toki's life should be put in the place of the stick, with the apple on his head, and should suffer with his own head for that windy boast, unless he who made the promise should with the first arrow that he tried strike the apple off it. Thus the treacherous slanders of others took up his half-tipsy vaunt, and the soldier was forced by his king's behest to do better than his promises, so that his words bound him to more than his own consequence. So Toki brought the lad forth, and warned him straitly to await the singing of the arrow with steadfast ear and unswerving head, so as not to balk, by any slight motion, the successful trial of his skill. Also he considered a plan to remove the lad's fear, and made him turn away his face, that he should not be scared by the sight of the missile. Then he put out 3 arrows from the quiver. The first that he fitted to the string struck the mark proposed. Eulogy on father and son. But when the king asked Toki why he had taken 3 shafts from the quiver, when he was to try his fortunes but once with the bow, Toki answered, "That I might avenge on thyself the miss of the first with the point of the others, lest perchance my innocence might suffer, and thy violence escape." End of Story of Toki and the Apple, by Saxo Grammaticus, circa 1204.
Tushmaker's Tooth Puller, by G.H. Darby. From Little Masterpieces of American Wit and Humor, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dale Grothman. Tushmaker's Tooth Puller, by G.H. Darby. Dr. Tushmaker was never regularly bred as a physician or surgeon, but he possessed naturally a strong mechanical genius and a fine appetite. and finding his teeth of great service in gratifying the latter propensity, he concluded that he could do more good in the world and create more real happiness therein by putting the teeth of its inhabitants in good order than any other way. So Tushmaker became a dentist. He was the man who first invented the method of placing small cogwheels in the back teeth for a more perfect mastication of food, and he claimed to be the original discoverer of that method of filling cavities with a kind of putty which, becoming hard directly, causes the tooth to ache so grievously that it has to be pulled, thereby giving the dentist 2 successive fees for the same job. Tushmaker was one day seated in his office in the city of Boston, Massachusetts, when a stout old fellow named Byles presented himself to have a back tooth drawn. The dentist seated his patient in the chair of torture, and, opening his mouth, discovered there an enormous tooth, on the right-hand side, about as large, as he afterward expressed it, as a small polyglot Bible. I shall have trouble with this tooth, thought Tushmaker, but he clapped on his heaviest forceps and pulled. It didn't come. Then he tried the turn screw, exerting his utmost strength, but the tooth wouldn't stir. Go away from here, said Tushmaker to Byles, and return in a week, and I'll draw that tooth for you, or know the reason why. Byles got up, clapped a handkerchief to his jaw, and put forth. Then the dentist went to work, and in 3 days he invented an instrument which he was confident would pull anything. It was a combination of a lever, pulley, wheel and axle, inclined plane, wedge, and screw. The castings were made, and the machine put up in the office, over an iron chair rendered perfectly stationary by iron rods going down into the foundation of the granite building. In a week old Byles returned. He was clamped into the iron chair, the forceps connected with the machine attached firmly to the tooth, and Tushmaker, stationing himself in the rear, took hold of a lever 4 feet in length. He turned it slightly. Old Byles gave a groan and lifted his right leg. Another turn, another groan, and up went the leg again. What do you raise your legs for? Asked the doctor. I can't help it, said the patient. Well, rejoined Tushmaker, that tooth is bound to come out now. He turned the lever clear round with a sudden jerk and snapped old Byles' head clean and clear from his shoulders, leaving a space of 4 inches between the severed parts. They had a post-mortem examination. The roots of the tooth were found extending down the right side, through the right leg, and turning up in 2 prongs under the sole of the right foot. No wonder, said Tushmaker, he raised his right leg. The jury thought so too, but they found the roots were decayed, and 5 surgeons swearing that mortification would have ensued in a few months, Tushmaker was cleared on a verdict of justifiable homicide. He was a little shy of that instrument for some time afterward, but one day an old lady, feeble and flaccid, came in to have a tooth drawn, and thinking it would come out very easy, Tushmaker concluded, just by way of variety, to try the machine. He did so, and at the first turn drew the old lady's skeleton completely and entirely from her body, leaving her a mass of quivering jelly in his chair. Tushmaker took her home in a pillowcase. The woman lived 7 years after that, and they called her the India Rubber Woman. She had suffered terribly with the rheumatism, but after this occurrence never had a pain in her bones. The dentist kept them in a glass case. After this, the machine was sold to the contractor of the Boston Custom House, and it was found that a child of 3 years of age could, with a single turn of the screw, raise a stone weighing 23 tons. Smaller ones were made on the same principle, and sold to keepers of hotels and restaurants. They were used for boning turkeys. There is no moral to this story whatever, and it is possible that the circumstances may have become slightly exaggerated. Of course, there can be no doubt of the truth of the main incidents. The End of Tushmaker's Tooth Puller by G. H. Darby.